The 31st argument made on the website godisimaginary.com is entitled Religion is Superstition. Really, the argument again focuses on something we've seen several times in this series, and that is on various aspects having to do with prayer. What the article asks you to do here is to think of how many terrible things are going on right now in the world. Just think of the million terrible things that must be going on. People who are starving to death, people who are being raped, their homes are being broken into, people who are dying. There surely are millions of terrible things that are going on in the world right now. According to Christian theology, God sees all of those things that are going on right now. And so what kind of a horrible God must God be to see every moment the millions of terrible things that are going on in the world and yet to do nothing about it? At the same time, the article argues that there are Christians that are sitting around and praying about trivial things. He uses the example of, some lady praying that she'll be able to get the stain out of her shirt or some other trivial thing. So there are Christians that are praying about trivial things, that those things might happen, and then they say, well, God, let me get this stain out of my shirt, but then at the same time there are people being murdered and raped and killed all over the world at the same time that the other is going on. And so he draws the conclusion that it's just superstition, it's just silliness to think that God cares about those little petty things that are going on in certain individuals' lives, and yet he ignores the millions of things that are going on in other people's lives. Surely, he argues, surely it would be the case that if God really existed, that he could not possibly stand to see all of these terrible things going on in the world. And therefore the conclusion is that the very notion of prayer is absurd. Now, I would say a number of things in response to this. The first one is that surely I think a point can be taken every once in a while here in these arguments that sometimes our understanding of prayer is rather trivial. Sometimes people offer things as prayers and get their feelings wrapped up in something that is really trivial and is indeed trivial, whether or not it happens or not, or whether or not they're able to accomplish something or not. If there are Christians out there or people who believe in God who say, God, let me have this, let me get a raise, or let me get this out of my shirt, or let me, let there be no traffic on my way to work this morning, and because it doesn't happen, because there is traffic, or because it doesn't rain when I ask God to let it rain, or because I don't get a stain out of my shirt whenever I pray, then I'm disappointed and I doubt the existence of God. Surely that is a trivial sense of prayer. And I would agree with that, and I think that that is something that, if that exists, and I'm sure that it does in various persons' lives, then I think that that calls for a deeper maturity in the life of prayer. Second point I would make is that this author leaves out the certainly millions of good things that are going on at every moment in the world. Surely the tendency just to concentrate on those things that are evil or that are bad in the world leaves out the enormous number of good things that are going on in the world. But I think there's an even bigger problem here. Rather than just trying to get a balance between good and evil things that are going on in the world, I think the deeper problem that I'd like to highlight here with this particular objection is that it assumes that God's relationship to the world is the same as my relationship to the world. So that when I look at the world at any given moment, I see all sorts of enormously terrible things that are going on, and it would be overwhelming and crushing to me to know, like for right now, if my phone were to ring every time something bad happened in the world, I'd go crazy in the next few hours or the next few days, just because my phone would never stop telling me about the horrible things that are going on in the world. If I assume that God is like me, he's sitting on the side just sort of getting data from the creation in time. So as he moves through each successive moment in time, he's getting this flood, this almost infinite flood of data about the creation at any given moment. This, of course, is not the sort of traditional Christian understanding of God at all. God instead sees all of time at once. That we are experiencing time in a series of moments, a series of incomplete moments, in which we fail to see the full picture and everything that is implied in every moment and in every action. So that in my life I could see each moment sort of isolated and on its own as I'm experiencing it. But God sees not in the isolated moments of life, but rather he sees our life in its entirety or in its completeness. Now, if that's the case, if God's standpoint toward the world, and by the way, this is not possible, or it is not possible for us to get a full sense of God's eternity. There's a fuller philosophical and theological argument for God's eternity, which, as Thomas Aquinas defines it, is the simultaneous presence of the whole to God. In other words, everything that is simultaneously present in God's eternity, because God is not changing. He's not receiving data in this slow sequence of accumulation. Instead, God dwells in every now moment simultaneously. We are receiving each moment in a long progression that we call our lifetime. God instead sees and dwells in the whole or the entirety of the historical process. In the entirety of time, God's eternity envelops it, and it is all present in God's now. Now, if that at all makes sense to you, and again, it's not an easy concept at all. In fact, it's a concept that defies complete comprehension. But I think there are some very powerful reasons why we argue this and why we believe that this is the case. Even people like Aristotle and others would admit philosophically the idea of the eternity of God, of the supreme unmoved reality that is not growing or changing with the creation, but instead stands in a different kind of relationship to time and to change than we do. So if it's the case that every moment is simultaneously present to God, then we would argue that this experience now that would bombard me of millions of bad things at any given moment is within God, seen within the context of eternity. That every now moment is seen by God in relationship to every other moment. So that if it's the case that the whole historical process, the whole sort of evolving of the universe and the growth of the universe toward its end or its purpose is seen by God in its infinite complexity simultaneously, then God sees, let's say, the moment of the rapist or the moment of the murderer or the moment of the thief or whatever. God sees that person's life in its entirety. So he sees not only the act of rape, but he also sees the subsequent consequences of that rape, whatever those might be, perhaps the torment of his conscience, perhaps the final judgment of that soul. God also sees the person who is the victim of these terrible acts, and he sees their life in its entirety. And so he sees them not only with the horrible experiences that they had, but also he sees them in the way that his grace and love is able to heal those experiences that they've had, or he sees them in their eternal condition and not just in that moment. And that God, within his infinite wisdom and understanding, is able to see the goodness of the kind of world that he allows to exist, even though in that good world that God has allowed to exist, there are many evils that take place. And so if we think of it not so much in terms of these isolated moments, but instead in its wholeness or in its entirety, I think we can begin to see how God relates to time and to events in time. Another important thing related to this, if we stop and step back and look at God's relationship to things, is that my mind is so limited and so small that for me to try to appreciate or understand a million evil acts or even a million good acts at any moment, for me to try to get a handle on that or to get a sense of that or to get my mind wrapped around is absolutely impossible. But if we think of God as knowing intimately and completely every moment and every detail, then we would more understand God's relationship to us or to an individual event in that moment, rather than seeing God as bombarded with a million events at one time. In other words, I relate to each moment as a finite creature that's only able to really concentrate on one or two things at a time. God instead is infinitely superior to me. God is able to relate to an infinity of moments, practically speaking, an infinity of moments and an infinity of creatures, an infinity of events simultaneously with an attentiveness and a relationship to those events, or a love for those creatures, or an understanding of the ultimate significance of each of those moments in relationship to his eternity and his infinity of knowledge and understanding. To try to move back and forth between God's way of being and my very small way of being and try to draw conclusions from that. Like, wouldn't God be overwhelmed with the evil in the world? Well, no, not because of the kind of being or reality that God is. God's not related to these events like we are. God is related to them in his infinite mode of being, and with his infinite complete knowledge of everything in its entirety, in its totality. We are creatures that are moving from moment to moment. For me to make a judgment on God based upon a moment of evil that exists in the world, or some moments of evil that exist in the world, is to put myself on the same level as God and God's perspective and God's ability to see the purpose and meaning of everything in the world. And so it is a rather arrogant act. Once we understand what we mean by God, it is an incredibly arrogant act, and the only way that the argument will work, it seems to me, is if we make God into being a very, very small being like we are. Instead, this is an infinite distance from what we believe and are convinced is true of God. And so my challenge to persons who may be concerned about these kinds of questions is to learn more about God and what we mean by God. And I think the more we learn about God, the more we're able to see that God is ultimately Lord over all of these moments, as terrible as they may be, and He's able to see them in relationship to a much grander and much bigger perspective on reality, one that I don't have.